In this lecture, which is really a more traditional introduction, we're going to talk about the very basics of belief in God. This week we're talking about God the Father. Well, where do we start? For some of you who have a background in theology or philosophy or other things, or have been part of deeper discussions over the years, or have been through many classes, this will be very introductory, and maybe so much so. But for others, sometimes it's the hard part of theology is just knowing where to start and feeling disconnected. It's like coming into a room where there's already conversations that have gone on for hours, and then you have to find a place to sit, and you start sitting down and you realize everyone already knows each other and are using terms that they've already established, and you just feel like an outsider, and then you just kind of get up and go to the bathroom and don't come back, and you just think they're already doing their thing because you're late to the party. Well, theology can be like that, and I think there's certain approaches to theology that encourages that. It's always nice for some people to feel like they're insiders, but theology isn't inherently like that. We all begin at a certain point. And so this is a description of some very basic themes and issues and approaches in coming to terms with God as God and how people have navigated it, but it's also an invitation. It's also a way of saying theology is not just the esoteric terms and complicated sentences and hard vocabulary. It's an invitation to a new kind of life. So whether you have extensive background, maybe this is just a refreshing new approach to theology for you. Just a reminder that theology is ultimately devotional. It's calling us to relate to God. Or if you're new to theology, this is a good way to realize that you're bringing something to the table, and that where much of this course will be talking about conversations and themes that are indeed difficult, and I'm not dismissing that, you're not excluded from that. There's pathways in, and so this is a pathway in at a beginning level, so that people, all of you, wherever you're coming from, whatever your background, can feel a welcome participant as this class goes forward. When we talk about Christian theology, over the centuries, especially the early centuries, people have tried to compile in an easily memorable way, a way that could be repeated and expressed, these conclusions of long discussions and debates as a way of compiling what is it that Christians believe. One example is this one, the Apostles' Creed. And as we enter into a discussion of God more fully this week, and as we continue this discussion, I think it's useful to show how it is the church in its early centuries emphasized what was important, what was vital, what essentially made Christian orthodoxy. To be a Christian, what were the things you had to believe? Now, the early church certainly didn't emphasize just the intellectual. It included that as part of the orientation, because what we believe affects what we do, but the early church also emphasized how we act and our passions in order. In reducing Christian theology only to the intellectual, we receive from the early church the intellectual portions, but we have to be careful not to also forget the rest. But since this is a class on systematic theology, we assume the actions, and we'll talk a little bit about the passions and emotions. But let's go back to that beginning part. What is it we believe? I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. He was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the third day he rose again. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. Amen. And this course will cover some of these. First article, I believe in God the Father Almighty, we'll talk about this week. I believe in God the Father Almighty. What does it mean to say this as a way of beginning Christian confession? To be a Christian, essentially, to be an Orthodox Christian especially, we say, I believe in God the Father Almighty. It's easy to jump ahead too far even in that phrase, but here in theology, we realize that words have different meanings to different people, and so it's worth considering more deeply even the basic language. What does it mean to say, I believe? Well, we can talk about different levels of, to say I believe in something isn't always a precise statement. It depends on what we're talking about, depends on the issue. Some things aren't as important that we believe, and some things we take so seriously we'll die for it, and yet the same word can be used in both those situations. So let's go through some levels of belief. This is drawn from Justo Gonzalez's book on the Apostles' Creed. The first level is uncertain but leaning. It's more of a preference. It's implies uncertainty. I believe this, this lecture that you're listening to is going to be less than an hour. I'm not, it might be around an hour. It might be a little more than an hour. At this point, as I begin, I'm not sure. What will I say? But I think it's going to be there. If I'm wrong, it's not that big of a deal. See, but I believe is sort of this preference, this leaning, this assumption. Is that what we say when we say I believe in the God the Father? Well, some Christians do actually have that. It doesn't really weigh much on their life, but they'll hold to that because that's what the culture is. I don't believe that's what the creed is implying. When I say I don't believe, I'm more certain but open. I have an opinion. When they wrote the creed, they were assuming that this is something that was affirmed absolutely. So in coming to the terms of this different level, maybe this isn't what the creed is either. I have an opinion, but I'm not absolutely certain. I believe there are students in this class. I'm pretty sure that's true, but how many students? How many are really students versus just being enrolled in the class? How many would consider themselves students of theology? See, there's a vagueness about that. So I believe there are students, but then, there are some details left open, and maybe I'm just talking to blank air. Maybe no one's even listening to this. I believe students are listening to this lecture. I hope, but are they? I don't know. The next level is certain, based on a decision. So this is where more decided intellectual engagement takes place. Something that I am convinced by. Others might disagree, but I think they're wrong. But there may be a varying level of opinions about this that is worth debating. A lot of theological topics take place in this range. I believe there's free will. Well, there's a question of that in terms of scriptural revelation, in terms of debate. We can talk about even the idea that I believe in a God. There's a certain sense that we can argue the rationality of belief in God, and we'll get to a little bit of that rational debate in just a second. So we can argue that there's these beliefs, but it's affirmed, but there might be some disagreement, and if there's disagreement, I'm willing to listen and hear what those are. The next level of belief is very certain. In this approach, it's not only an intellectual assent over something that is arguable or that you're not willing to invest in. This is actually being so convicted about something, so convinced that you're willing to test it, that it's something that is testable, that it's not just some idea that is just a matter of wrangling over words or opinions or ideas. It's actually something in the world that you are convinced is true and are willing to try it out. So you're absolutely willing to test, willing to risk. I think a great example of this is this picture. This was not long after the invention of bulletproof glass. Now the man behind the glass is very certain that that glass is bulletproof. He believes, we can say, the glass is bulletproof. So too, hopefully, does the policeman believe it's bulletproof. They're so convinced that they're both willing to do a test, see if it's true, and if it's not true, uh-oh, but they know it's true. So they're not taking as much of a risk as it might seem because they know this is actually a true thing. Or another example is I want to go to Portland, Oregon, and from where I'm sitting right now, that would require, I believe, Interstate 5 would take me there. Now, there's other ways I might be able to get there, but they all go basically the same direction and have the same basic path. But then there are significantly other ways not to go there. If I were to take, for instance, I-80, I wouldn't ever get to Portland. maybe eventually Portland, Maine, but that's not the Portland I want to go to. Or, even more detailed, if I took I-5 and went south, I wouldn't go to Portland, I'd go to San Diego. So I believe that taking I-5 north would get me to Portland. I'm willing to get in my car and test it out. Now, could something go wrong? Sure. The freeway could be closed down, something could happen. All things could happen, but I'm very certain that that's the way to go if I wanted to drive there. Now, the final stage of belief, which is assured, it's defining. This is where belief goes beyond just a simple set of ideas or even a specific task. And this is where belief becomes a experience, a way of coming to terms with this world, with what is true, with reality. We could say, I believe in gravity in light of this, for instance. The idea that gravity doesn't care if I believe in it, but my belief in gravity affects how I navigate certain realities in this world. I believe in gravity, so when I'm on the edge of a cliff, I am not going to step off. If I didn't believe in gravity, maybe I'd float away. But I believe in gravity, so I'm going to live in light of that is true, and it affects my everyday life. So I'm willing to stake everything on it. I'm willing to say the whole of reality is shaped in this way. It defines not only specific tasks, but it defines a lot of other things that may be even indirectly related, and yet it is always there as a fact and truth. So in light of believing in God the Father, we say we trust God. We say that this reality of God, this truth, is not just a opinion among other opinions we can share. We say even when we don't understand everything, even when we don't feel confident in what's happening around us specifically, we believe that this is true so much that our trust in it transcends our understanding. Now, as an example of this, we have the early church, those who contributed to writing this creed. They believed in these words so much, many of them, including almost all the early church writers we have from before Constantine, were willing to die for it. They said, we believe that God is the only God, so we won't sacrifice to the emperor. And the emperor or his governors said, if you don't sacrifice to the emperor, we're going to kill you. And they said, no, we believe Jesus is our Lord. And the governor would say, well, that's fine. I believe in other things. You can believe what you want. See, the Roman officials had different kinds of belief, whereas the Christian says, we believe in this, thus there is no exception. There is no other reality that we can participate in without denying the fact that Jesus is Lord. So they are willing to say, Jesus is Lord, and however it happens, you are going to be wrong, and you may even kill us. But we are still right, because God transcends this experience. Think about the story in Daniel, that great story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You all know the flannel graph version, if nothing else, where they're put into the fire because they don't want to worship Nebuchadnezzar. But as they go in, Nebuchadnezzar says, if you don't worship me, I'm going to throw you in the fire. And I love this verse. They say, our God is able to save us. But even if he doesn't save us, he's still God. I mean, that is trust and belief. And of course, he does end up saving him. But we have testimonies like that you read about in Hebrews 11 and in Acts and elsewhere, where God doesn't step in and save someone from execution. But what we know, what we believe in, is God's reality, God's work in this world transcends our experience of time and space, so that even death has no sting. That's the declaration of the resurrection. See, this is why we start with the resurrection, because we come back to this. We say, why do we believe in God the Father the way we do? What level of belief can we offer to this? Well, Jesus died and he raised again. We believe in light of that truth, and that changes how then we walk through every element of our life. I like what Justo Gonzalez says. The main thrust is that we trust God for our lives, and also that it is in this God that we live and believe, that this God is both the foundation and the context of all our belief. So this assuredness in belief, we can say, really is an orientation. Paul in Philippians 1:21 says, to live is Christ. So it's not just this belief is something, an opinion that we can, among other opinions, just one religion among other religions. What we're saying is this is true for everyone, whether or not they believe in it. And in this belief, we also say that it affects every part of our life. It affects every element of our life. It defines us as people in this world beyond any other category. There is no other category that intercedes or offers a a definition over this. This is our primary definition because we believe these things are true, thus we live in these things. It's the way of Jesus Christ. It's not just a do religious things, but when we say God, Father Almighty, creator of the heaven and earth, and all the other ways we could talk about this, whether in creeds or in scripture, what we're testifying to is God is all, in all, and that we, in participating in God, participate in this wholeness, in this fullness. But that doesn't leave out any part of our life, not our intellect, not our sexuality, not our sociality, nothing. All of it is brought into then the lordship of Christ. Another issue, as we move on and in this introduction, is when we say we believe in God. Well, what do we establish that in? What is the proof of that? And over the centuries, people have tried to come up with proofs of God that didn't rely on direct revelation, because if, God shows up and talks to you, that's one thing. But how do you share about God and have other people believe in God who don't have necessarily a direct experience? And there was an assumption that they could logically prove that the God exists, and in light of that, then add some extra details about what this God is like. But first, you start from the idea, is there even God? Now, I'm going to give you 4 basic approaches, and for those of you with a philosophy or theology background, I apologize for how introductory this is. But even still, hopefully it's a good reminder to think through it again. And for those of you who are new to these things or have studied them only briefly in the past, hopefully it's a helpful entryway into how other people come to terms with it. Even still, because even though these are historic arguments, there's still underlying beliefs and ways to come to terms with God that you hear in a lot of places. So one, the cosmological argument. Aristotle, among others, argued for this. Basically the idea, and they can use a lot of different analogies and a lot of different themes, but it comes down to someone started the fire. We know that something in motion was put in motion. Something that happened has a cause to that happen. Some things in history we know don't just happen purely out of nothingness. Something doesn't just start moving randomly. Even if you can't see how it's moving, something moved it. So too, then that's the argument for God that is offered here. The idea that everything has a cause. Something caused something, which was caused by 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 something. I could go on and on for eternity, but I won't. And at a certain point, you come back to the uncaused cause. The idea that there has to be at some point something that was a cause for something else, but wasn't caused for itself. Now they say, then that's God. God isn't caused, God causes. Another way of saying it, the unmoved mover. The idea that something that is in motion was put in motion by something else, which was put in motion by something else, which was put in motion by something else. You get the sense. At a certain point, you have the thing that put something else in motion that was in motion in its own motion. It wasn't caused to be put in motion, but it causes. So, what's that? That's God. Now, clearly, that's not giving a lot of Christian testimony to the details. It's not saying there's a lot left out of that. But what it's arguing is a logical idea that a God exists. So it's a starting place. It became very common throughout the centuries in different times, and really also especially in the modern area where they try to recover some of these, and in a lot of contemporary apologetics, you still hear a lot of this. Anselm, a Christian theologian from the medieval era, argued for a different way, what can be called the ontological argument. Here I frame it as perfect is as perfect does. So the idea here is think of something that is wonderful. Pick a category. Think of your favorite vacation. What's the place you would most want to be at? Think, it doesn't even have to be real. Just think of the most ideal place and see how it would be together. See, I would like a house in the middle of a forest that's near an ocean, for which I can buy for under $100,000, right? So I can go sailing and kayaking and enjoy the forest, and also drive into town and have a community there. That sounds a pretty ideal way for me to live. You can tell I'm an introvert, and I like water sports. Now, what would make that even more perfect? I mean, that sounds great. What would make it more perfect? If it were actually true. There's a level of perfection that can exist in our mind, but what makes the idea the most perfect possible? That is actually true in reality, because reality is more perfect than just the imagination of it. So, in light of that, we can imagine a God We can imagine a perfect being with all sorts of traits we can live up. Well, what's better than that? A God that really exists. So, because God is perfect, God must be the most perfect of all perfections, thus he must exist. Well, that's a pretty interesting way of coming to terms with it. The idea that God's perfection then brings God's existence as a necessity. Now, there were a lot of arguments against this because clearly I just described my own ideal place to live, and that doesn't exist. So just because I can imagine something, the perfect place, doesn't mean then it comes into being, because otherwise it's imperfect. So too with God. The idea that God exists simply because we can imagine something is good rhetorically, maybe even decent logically, but isn't an absolute surefire proof. So Anselm's argument has been pretty well dismissed, though you do get a certain sense that people hold on to this in a less than formal way, where they say God is, I am in need of healing, thus I need God, because God, I need healing. And something in this universe has to be able to provide healing, and I can't just exist without that possibility, so thus I believe in God. See how that becomes a ontological argument out of necessity or out of context. Another approach would be Blaise Pascal, a French mathematician, a theologian, philosopher. He was good at everything. I actually like this one. This is one that is, even if it's not logically absolute proof, has been helpful during times of my life. This is what's called Pascal's wager, and I term it going all in. Basically, Pascal's wager is, if God exists, then it's worth believing in him. If God doesn't exist, it doesn't matter if you believe in him or not, because it won't have nothing will change. But if God exists and you don't believe in him, then you're on the wrong side of God and will suffer eternal damnation. So, if you had to bet, the best position to be in life is to believe God exists, because that's the only way that offers a win. And not believing in God doesn't affect anything at all. If God doesn't exist, nothing happens. Nothing changes. So it's the only bet that has the possibility of a proactive future. So choose that, because that's the only one where you would actually experience direct loss. Well, is that fair? You know, there have been times in my life where I really struggled with my belief in God, especially in college, and in times of real hurt and frustration in church experiences. And I'm like, this is just a waste. The people around me aren't living this out. I can hold on to some theoretical concept of God, but I don't see how this is working out. God doesn't seem to be part of my life. In my prayers, and things just getting worse and worse the more I seek after him. What do I do? And there really was this time of, I better keep going, because if it's not true, then life just is misery anyhow. But if it is true, then my only hope is to stick with it. Well, I stuck with it, and God continued to work. Finally, this approach. This isn't a formal topic, and you may not even find this in a lot of philosophical discussions, but I'm convinced it is a necessary category to add in, especially given a talk of Wolfhart Pannenberg and others in recent eras that have recovered this sense. It was also a driving sense, I would argue, in Scripture. The idea that proof in God comes from history. Exodus is an example of that. Stuff happens. So why should you believe in God? Well, God didn't present Moses with some cosmological or ontological or other proof saying, now here let me convince that what you're hearing is actually the God of the universe. And then Moses didn't go down and have some PowerPoint slides that displayed logically path through that, oh yes, this is who we God. What did God say to Moses? Tell Pharaoh that I'm going to free the people, and that he needs to free the people, and I'm going to bring you into the promised land. And Moses said, what? I don't know what you're to say about that. And God said, no, tell him that. And because I am the God who is going to free you from Egypt. Tell the people, I am the God who's going to free you from Egypt. Well, that puts it on the line, because here we have this instance, do you believe in God or not? Well, at first you say there's a risk in it. Do we believe in this God? But then if God actually proves himself, that the people are freed from Egypt, then suddenly God has shown to not only the Israelites, but also to the Pharaoh and the Egyptians, that God is God, because he has established it, whether or not anyone wants to believe it or not. He has done a thing. So too, we can say in Christian terms, this is the reality of the resurrection. The idea that God says in Jesus, I am going to die, and then I'm going to be raised again in 3 days. That doesn't happen. That's not something that's a logical consequence. That's not something that happens, say, one thing that causes another. People don't die and then 3 days later just come back to life. So going back to the cosmological argument, it's saying God started something without having to rely on some predetermined cause or event or movement. Jesus came back to life. So the early disciples believed in Jesus because they said, this is clearly God's work. We can trust the God who revealed himself in Jesus because of this thing that happened that was an impossible thing, yet God did anyhow. So it's a historical argument. Carry this forward. What do we think about God? What are his attributes? Well, so too, in many ways, this is drawn from not necessarily specifically Christian or even Jewish conversations, but when early writers were trying to talk about who God is, they relied on conversations that were happening. So philosophical arguments. What makes a God a God? Well, a God is omniscient. A God is omnipresent. A God is omnipotent. A God is impassive, unaffected, and unchanging. And there's a few others, but I don't want to add too many to the list. So we can see these as part of the what is called classical theism, the idea that these are the categories that scholars, early philosophers, early theologians looked at as a way of describing how we see God of the Bible reflecting these elements, and then describing the God of the Bible in light of these. So much so that by the time of the medieval era, we have someone like Aquinas and later Calvin and theologians up to our time arguing that these are categories in which we can describe God's being and presence, because God is not only a God, God is the God. So God must exemplify all these elements. Well, again, that's an interesting way of coming to terms with it. And yet, is it everything? God is infinite, we say, but what does it mean to be infinite? What does it mean for God to know all things? What does it mean for God to be present everywhere? All these things can be described in different ways. What does it mean to be impassive? Well, that very word, without passions, is the primary definition. Well, that word may mean one thing in one era and something different in our era. In the early era, passions were something that were caused. So God, being the uncaused cause, isn't affected by other things by definition. He's not someone who's vulnerable to his emotions being bopped around. But in our era, when we say impassive, that's not the positive, the idea that God isn't dependent on change, but what we say is that does God not have an emotions? How can God love if God is impassive? So rather than see it in terms of changefulness, we see it in terms of relationality. Now, that term then becomes something different. So this is the tricky part of using these established categories and then applying them to the God we find in the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is another model. So when we talk about I believe in a God, we don't just have just the Greek and then fit God into that. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. Those are very helpful, especially in a contextual place where Christian theology developed. But we have to make sure that we understand that those aren't necessarily the primary definitions that God uses in Scripture. Are they there? I think that's arguable, and I think that's not in a negative sense. I think that those certainly can be there. But is that the best starting point? Well, maybe, maybe not. And if those are sticking points in some ways, let's come back to what we know about God's attributes from a Hebrew perspective. The idea that God has revealed himself in a certain way to certain people, and in prioritizing that revelation, we need to come to terms with God has chosen to share something about himself and not then ignore those things for the sake of other categories. We should listen to how God chooses to describe himself. I am. I like this scene from The Prince of Egypt.
It's too early for this. Here I am. Take the sandals from your feet. For the place on which you stand is holy ground. Who are you? I am that I am. I don't understand. I am the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
You were born of my mother, Yocheved. You are our brother.
What do you want with me? I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and have heard their cry.
Stop it! Leave that man alone!
So I have come down to deliver them out of slavery, and bring them to a good land. A land flowing with milk and honey. And so unto Pharaoh I shall send you. Me? Who am I to lead these people? They'll never believe me. They won't even listen. I shall teach you what to say.
Let my people go!
But I was their enemy. I was the prince of Egypt, the son of the man who slaughtered their children.
You've chosen the wrong messenger. How can I even speak to these people? Who made man's mouth? Who made the deaf, the mute, the seeing, or the blind? Did not I? Now go!
Moses, I shall be with you when you go to the king of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not listen. So I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders. Take the staff in your hand, Moses. With it, you shall do my wonders. I shall be with you, Moses.
Think about attributes of God in light of that story. What comes to mind? Think about it for a second. Hit pause. How would you describe the God shown in this scene, which is from the book of Exodus? And is a pretty... I like this version among other versions because I think it evokes the kind of scene that comes to mind when I read it. Well, here's what I came to mind. God is involved. God's participating in this world. God is mighty. Now, is that different than omniscient? I think so. There's a certain sense of omnipotent. I mean, it's God. It's different than omnipotent because omnipotent is sort of a potentiality. It's possible. While mighty conveys a sense of engagedness. It's an application. God is committed. God isn't turned aside or convinced otherwise. God has a plan. God has a promise. And even as Moses tried to push it away that his role, and God said, no, this is how it's going to be. God is passionate. And this is where I see a distinction in how we understand the term impassive in contemporary terms in a different way than it was used earlier. The idea here is that God expresses love. God expresses anger. He gets angry at Moses. They're all through the Old Testament. We see these expressions of relational connection. And we have to incorporate that within our concept of God, lest we undermine how God has chosen to reveal himself. And God is eternal. Again, is that the same as infinite? I think there's a certain element of eternal that has a application, and since it is different, it's not pure numbers. It's God is lasting. We can think of eternal love, eternal being, eternal presence. There's a presence about it, and a connection in that. It's not just on paper, but that is fills what we experience in time and space and beyond. Eternal, both in terms of looking forward, but also eternal in terms of width, breadth, time, all the many dimensions. God fills all these things. It's different. See how we might describe it in a lot. And in being different, it also conveys to us a different experience with God, and also conveys in us a different way of expressing God. And God is intent about this expression. God is willful. God has a purpose. God has a plan. God isn't just a clockmaker who just makes something and then puts it and turns it on and lets it go running. God is, in being involved, in being mighty, in being committed, in being passionate in God, and being eternal. God has goals and puts these into practice. Okay, so we say, I believe in God. We have the creeds, we have the early church writings, we have scripture. Well, why keep debating? Why have a class on theology? Why not have a bullet point list, which is essentially what a creed is, or a set of statements to memorize, which is often how catechesis, the training of early Christians, they ask some set questions and you give set answers and it's all established. So is there a living element to Christian theology? So why keep asking questions? Why is theology a continuing task? Well, there's many reasons for that. Sometimes people just like to make things complicated, but I don't think that's really the core reason for most people. We never, as people, really encounter the world purely as observers. We don't trust anyone else, and our own experiences interpret the world for us. And so our own journey through life involves our own questions, our own answers in light of what is true. And so we continue to ask questions. Whether or not it's good questions or good answers, that's up in the air. But at the core of what it means to be human is a search for the incomprehensible. The idea that there's something beyond us and we want to know. And simply because other people have asked the question doesn't necessarily mean that we are content with that, or that it's the same questions, or that the answers in the past have come to terms with what we know about the world today. What is incomprehensible about the world in our era is different than what was incomprehensible about the world 2,000 years ago. Now, there's some overlap, certainly, but there's a lot we do know. And so can we continue to believe in God in light of what we know now as opposed to 2,000 years ago? Many people would say no. Many people would say, what's the point? But others would say, no, there's still things in this reality that cause us and drive us forward that we don't know. We don't have answers to. Even science can't give us the answers to what is life's meaning and life's purpose. And we're just not content. The heart is insatiable. Until we have an answer, we can't just ignore it and say, oh, well, let's move on. Sometimes in times of great stress, of course, that happens. But in times in which we are sitting by ourselves on those quiet evenings, those questions erupt, and we're driven to have some sort of answer. And again, it's not enough that some other people have found the answers. We continue to seek it ourselves, and we can be helped by others. We can be guided by others. But we're driven as people to want to know. And add to this that the theology has been mediated. So a mediated God in cultures and history. Now, this is troublesome for some people to come to terms with, but it's true. The idea that what we say about God has come down to us through cultures and times and specific places and what they knew about the world at that time, the kinds of languages they used, the kinds of questions they had, the kinds of culture and values they had into how they responded to others around them. So many different things that make up our culture became the way that God revealed himself in the midst of that. And then people took that revelation and described it in light of what they knew about the world. Now, does that rule out everything? No, it just means that, again, all theology is contextual. All theology is derived from a certain experience of life and then is never entirely translatable. So just like a language, we can translate languages, but languages have their own character and emphases and definitions, and so translation is always also a matter of interpretation. So when we have a mediated God, a God that has been transmitted to us through very different cultures, and not only different languages or different settings, the idea that I like what Mark Knoll said, that history is a different culture. We have this perspective that even in our European-derived theology, that somehow that is its own thing that has stayed static in the last 1,000 years. No. I would argue that the contemporary setting here in California, or wherever you're at, is almost entirely different than the setting in 19th century or 20th century Germany. I mean, you can share some traits, but the way of encountering the world, the assumptions, the historical background, let alone those who are around here with different histories, those who have slavery or other forms of racism, or women's experience in history is different than a upper class, wealthy, white British scholar. So all these things have been mediated, and so we are driven to come to terms with God in light of those contributions, but those contributions aren't everything. Whereas in traditional approaches to theology said that's all there is to say, here learn these things, we know that no, that's what there is to say in light of that context and setting, but God is bigger than that context and that setting. I like what Elizabeth Johnson writes in Quest for the Living God. The profound incomprehensibility of God, coupled with the hunger of the human heart in changing historical cultures, actually requires that there be an ongoing history of the quest for the living God that can never be concluded. In an interest of trying to wrestle with how different eras are themselves different cultures, and Christian theology has been transmitted and mediated through these different cultures and different contexts, I'm going to venture into a extreme simplification of historical thought. It's still useful, like a map. You can have very detailed streets, or you can zoom out and show pictures of entire regions. Neither one of them are wrong or right. One shows more details. This is a big, broad view, and I think it's helpful as we come to terms with why theology was written in certain ways, how it developed, and what we're receiving and what we're having to deal with. So I've divided history roughly into 3 different eras: pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. So in this first section, I'm going to talk about pre-modern. What drove the pre-modern understanding of God, discussion of God? Well, in the pre-modern questions of God and reality of ourselves, the experience of life was the world is against us. Before the modern era, the world was a very tricky place to live in, especially if you didn't have wealth and were dependent on the world around you. If you were to walk away from your nice city now and go off to your nearest wilderness area without any food and without any water, you'd quickly realize that the world is not on your side. There are things that want to eat you out there. It's harsh. It can get very cold. It can get very hot. The world has so many different ways of trying to kill you and undermine you. What if you're a farmer? If you're a farmer, you do all this work, and then for whatever reason it stops raining for this year, and then it stops raining for next year. Well, what happened in the pre-modern era? You starved. The world was seen as a foe, something that had to somehow be navigated, even though it seemed to always raise up these challenges in unexpected ways. Life was precarious. Life was very physical. The encounter with the world wasn't primarily existential. Who am I in my own calling and sense of self? Some people had that, but that's usually a sign of privilege, the idea that everything else is taken care of so you can now look internally. Most people throughout history, and even still, have a very physicalized sense of this life. I need to eat. I need to drink. I need to have some kind of housing. I need to be protected from either the physical dangers or other people around me who want my food and want my drink and want my housing. So life was very physical, and so they try to navigate questions of God in light of these things, coping with life that couldn't be explained in what they knew about the world. And so they came up with ways of talking about gods that helped give some sense of patterns and response. What humans can deal with a lot if they have some kind of way of feeling like they can nudge it more towards themselves. People were vulnerable. People were vulnerable to each other. People were vulnerable to this world. People then felt they were vulnerable to this power that was beyond what they could see. And how then do we navigate that vulnerability? A couple of ways of approaching it were, you could either say everything is a god, there's pantheism. So if I need it to rain or I need the crops to grow, I need to say that God, these things are gods. And effectively that was true. The rain, the forests, the trees, the things that brought life, those had a godlike function because they had the power of life or death over them. I mean, we can say that is a rough definition of what a god is. It's something that has power of life and death. So if everything is a god, then you try to find ways of saying, tree, help me out here. River, don't flood. Clouds, bring me rain. God is in these things, and the power of the universe, the power of the earth was something to be directly addressed. Or the other approach is polytheism. The idea that it's not that the trees are God or the moon is a god. It's that there's a bureaucracy of sorts. Everyone's in charge of something. Everything has a manager. So there's someone. If you have a complaint, if you go to a restaurant or go to the store and something goes wrong, you say, "Let me talk to the manager." It's a little bit like polytheism. Everyone has something. You wouldn't say that there's one person in charge of all the stores and restaurants you ever go to, but what you say is there's a manager of the Target. There's a manager of the Chili's. There's a manager of the supermarket or this restaurant. There's managers. And if you want to fix something, you talk to that manager in a way that manager is able to do something. So there's someone in charge of the rain. There's someone in charge of the weather. There's someone in charge of war, of death, of life. Go on, of love. The picture I post is of the Norse answer to those questions. The god of thunder, Thor, and his father, the god of wisdom and other things, whose name hopefully you recognize. And hopefully you know why I pick these of all the pagan cultures. There's many to pick, but everyone has their way and they overlap. But everyone has their way of trying to come to terms with who's in charge. Because if something goes wrong, I want to complain or I want to find a way of putting it right. So that you either divinize nature in this way. You say there's gods and there's managers and there's something that is important because then I can, if I steer them in the right direction, they'll help me. Or the other approach in ancient cultures and even up to this day is to dismiss it altogether. The idea that none of this really matters. So you have ancient approaches that really were very nature religion, and you had ancient approaches and pre-modern approaches that said this physical stuff is just what it is. What is true is your spiritual self. What is true is this thing that's beyond us. And all these physical stuff gets in the way, but it doesn't matter. That's not real. That's evil. This is all corrupt. See, feel pain? That's not how it should be. See, we're called to rise out of this, to leave behind our physical body. So they dismissed the idea of nature. You get this in some Gnostic approaches, that matter was evil, and we have to not pay attention to it. Fear of nature gave way to fear of God in Christian circles, in Jewish circles, so that God's presence in this world gave hope to being sheltered from nature's domination. Neither divinizing nature nor dismissing it, but saying God, who is the creator of all things, has organized all things so that we are invited to join in with what he intended, but that has gone wrong. And so the questions of much of theology over the many centuries has been based on the idea of this. The world is against us, but God is for us. We're not called to leave this world, but we're not called to depend on it because God's in charge. Move to the modern era.
I'm a little concerned right now about your salvation and stuff. How come you have not been baptized?
Because I never got around to it, okay? I don't know why you always have to be judging me. Because I only believe in science.
But tonight, we are going up against Satan's caveman. And I just thought it would be a good idea if you...
A silly scene from a silly movie, but I think it so perfectly encapsulates that move from medieval, pre-modern to modern approaches, that distinction. I only believe in science. And how do you respond to that? It's sort of then, it becomes a power play. But that's what modernity does. Modernity changed the questions of God and reality ourselves, and yet not so smoothly. There are those who still were in one era, and as they moved to another era, didn't quite make the transition. In the modern era, technology, science, philosophy moves the situation from being the world against us to now us against the world. Reason was able to come to terms with our behavior, our patterns of government, our patterns of life. Reason was able to analyze and assess the natural world and not only describe it, but also learn how to manipulate it, how to put things together that nature hadn't put together, how to utilize these things in new ways that helped life be more secure. So how do you do that? One approach to this is foundationalism. The idea that you don't have to always start from scratch, but you build on certain categories, certain beliefs, truths, and in light of those truths being truth, you can build and construct a level of increasingly complicated knowledge so that what we have around us today didn't erupt wholesale from the mind of one person, but the way I'm talking in a microphone, the computer screen you're looking at, the environment you're in. These were all unless you're sitting outside. These are all slowly developed processes over time, building on the fact that what had gone before. And in light of that, you could make reason go beyond one generation, beyond one culture, and interact across time and space and continue to move forward so that humanity's advanced in science, in understanding of the world so rapidly once it realized this. The idea there's also this understanding, because there's general rules about science and patterns that then we can approach. There's laws of nature. There's laws of physical properties. So too we say there's universal rules for everything, and there's general rules. We don't have to get lost in the details or stuck, but that we can come up with these general patterns and apply these general patterns to life around us, both in science and in social situations, and go down the list. There's a dialectic approach, which developed out of classical models, but became really a central way of coming to terms with religion or other approaches, where you have extremes, and then how do you navigate the extremes? How do you find ways of, rather than having to say that it has to be only this or only that, and say, well, there's these elements that they're both offering, let's find a synthesis. So you have a thesis and antithesis, and you have a synthesis of drawing together the truth that can derive from different perspectives and approaches. It basically became idealizing the objective model, that someone could rise above all these things and point to a truth that allowed for continued deeper conversation and analysis. Now it's left a kind of binary thinking. It's either this or that, on or off, one thing or the other thing. But that's an easier way of going through life, because the more complexity you have, the more you tend to get caught in the complexity rather than going in the direction that is helpful. You either go north or south, northwest, southeast. These are complications, but if you go generally northish, that's good enough. If I want to get to Portland, I go north. Right? Now, is that exact? No, but it's good enough. So too, we have this then applied to God. The proofs of God, which were the arguments for theism, became the deciding element of a logical, reasoned approach to even spiritual matters. Well, the problem with that is, in establishing God on the basis of reason, once those reasons were countered, you get stuck in the opposite approach, atheism. God, who is disproven through those logic, no longer has to be believed, and then you can thrust us off. And in a world in which you can control your reality around you, in which you can actually, we can get to terms where we can destroy the whole world, you don't need a God. You don't need to have some kind of outside answer. So God became less relevant for immediate purposes and less than relevant for even existential concerns. Nature became something to be subdued and conquered. In modernity, humanity learned how to oppress nature. Technology and science gave insights into the ways of this world, and with this insight came a new stance toward the world, one of domination rather than intimidation. So we dominate, we control, and then the assertion of power became a matter of those who dominate have the most selfness. they're the ones in charge. Welcome to colonialism, the idea of applying these universal truths to what they thought were cultures who didn't have them. And they argued, and this is sincerely, that it was good they were being conquered because otherwise they were going to be stuck in these backward ways. They thought they were being benevolent. We now know, of course, that that's arrogant beyond measure and certainly not Christian. And yet, in coming to terms with God in certain ways and reason in certain ways and culture in certain ways, the assumption was that there is this progressing of humanity that some people need help to find. We know now in the 21st century that this has problems. And even before the end of the 20th century, after World War II especially, there was a realization that we have a lot of answers, we have a lot of control, we have the ability to dominate, but there's still a problem here. And we come back to questions of God and reality. So in the postmodern era, questions responded to the problems of modernity. And as of yet, we haven't really had a entirely new category of putting this in, though I think there are directions that are coalescing and forming so that maybe at a certain point we'll actually have a name besides post. What is it not? But for now, a lot of the questions that are driving us are reflections of the inadequacy of the modern era and respond to the reality that the modern era isn't so entirely gone, that a significant amount of modern assumptions and practices very much are embedded into much of our lives. We feel tensions with this, but they're still true, and whole categories of our lives, in fact, dependent on that modern approach, yet it's not enough. In the postmodern era, we're not dealing necessarily with the issue that's the world against us. Some places are, but here in most of our contexts, that's not the driving issue. I know some of you may disagree with that in recent events, but for the most part, we say we can navigate the problems of the world without just simply the world crushing us and destroying us. It's not easy, but we have ways of navigating it, except in times of extreme emergency. But most of our regular daily life isn't caught up in just trying to eat and drink. And we also realize that even though we have the ability to live in this world, we also have the ability to destroy this world. We have the ability to really make the world around us messy. We have the ability to destroy the environment, but in getting things that we want that help us do the things we want, we have the ability to cause damage that can't be repaired. And not only that, we have the ability to destroy the entire world. The nuclear weapons, since the mid-20th century, we actually have the capability to destroy everything. Well, that's a problem. We can't say it's us against the world now that we have the ability to completely destroy the world and everyone in it, because we realize that now that's a capability that needs some caution. And so in the postmodern era, it's really attempting to navigate us and the world together, involved in this process together, dependent on it, connected to it, but neither victims nor victimizers of it. So simple answers are not enough. It's simple to say we're vulnerable to the world if we're in a situation where we don't have the resources or capability to navigate everything. It's also simple to say we can take what we want however we want it. Well, that's true in a certain sense, but when in doing that we destroy it, that's not good enough. So those answers address the world, but they don't necessarily even address our experiences in it. They don't address the dynamic of relationships, the dynamic of participating together, both in light of our past and what we're going to pass on to the future. It's one thing to say I can take what I want, but it's another thing to say I need to make sure there's things for my children and my children's children. So what was realized in the attempt to have general and universal answers to apply to every category of life, that rather than these being purely neutral and objective, they were ways of telling a story about the world so that some had power and some didn't. These narratives were called meta-narratives, this grand way of controlling how people understand the world and understand history and understand progress, so that then power could be applied to make sure that these narratives stay true, whether or not they are inherently true. So postmodernism started saying, wait a second, these meta-narratives aren't inherently true, and they are also securing power for some. So postmodern said, let's undermine, let's address these meta-narratives, let's fight against the power structures so that there could be a more cohesive community of all together. But now that raises another question. In pushing against the meta-narratives, the idea that there's an organizing sense, there's a story at all, it raised the question, is there truth? Is there anything that is even that is this overarching way of coming to terms with this world that binds us together, or are we just all these separate little structures making our way? Is there truth? Is there something universal? Is there something that is actually an objective reality? Maybe we can't encounter that ourselves, but that's a different thing to say there doesn't exist at all. So, especially in continental approaches to postmodern philosophy, they in their experiences, especially in light of the church history, the great wars, which so undermined the sense of life and death and hope, that there was a confusion. So they emphasized relativism, the idea that everything is relative, everything is purely about one's own perspective, and there's no universal binding truth, and deconstruction. Every power structure has to be identified and undermined. And this left the conversation with this deconstructed relative perspective, but how then do you create a unified society in light of that? So this is where we can talk about relativity rather than purely relativism. Relativity, of course, is what Einstein emphasizes in his discussion of the perspective of our experience in this world. And we have this perspective that changes, but that doesn't mean there's not universal qualities. For instance, the speed of light is a universal fact, and yet the speed we're traveling affects our understanding of time, of space, and go down the list. So there can be approaches to a relative embrace of our perspective that also allows for universal truth to work together in a complex idea that you can't dismiss either the particular or the universal. And this, I would argue, really is reflected more in the Anglo-American approach. The idea that there's universals, but that there's a complexity, which can be used in the images of, rather than foundationalism, everything is built on this, and that tends to secure power structures and set ways. That knowledge really is about a web, that our experience in this world is about a web, and there's that you can have different centers of influences that are interconnected and influential without being wholly dependent on another, and yet you can construct a secure, objective form of knowledge that is true, but that isn't so easily limited to some bullet points. We can look at this in like ecological diversity, for instance. You can say that there are trees and there are bugs and there are plants, and you can talk about plants in a very general sense, and you can say, be very broad, but that doesn't actually describe what happens in a specific setting. So as I look out the window now, I see a tree, but in that tree there are bugs, there's flowers, there's bees, there's birds, there's animals that interact, and that this context I'm in has an ecology, and that ecology represents the weather, the amount of rainfall we get, the soil, the geological history, the use of it that people have put to it. So everything around has a interconnectedness that depends on each other, even though there's a separateness and particularity about it. So that the ecology of this place is different than the ecology, for instance, in somewhere that's much farther north and much colder, in a different part of the world, or much farther south and much warmer. So we can talk about the ecology of a place that allows for both a diversity and a cohesiveness, while still involving some general rules. There's something that makes a bird, a plant, a plant. True moderation consists, not as many people seem to think, in always seeking the middle between 2 points, but in trying to recognize the point of truth and holding to it, more of a center set of truth. There's an orientation. There are things that are established, but around that things can, we might even say, dance. By participating together in integrated life that no longer pursues dominance or independence, we can begin to both bring healing to the destruction and find new understanding of God, who is leading us to an integrity with all that God has done and made. God is creating something new, a new heaven, a new earth, and a new people to gather together. So this is why the summary of the law isn't do all these things because God says so. It's love God, love your neighbor. That's why you sum up the law, this law of love. Well, that's a relational quality that resonates through every action and practice. God creates an ecology of how we are to live in interdependence and connection with and for each other. Well, there's a postmodern theology. Describing it in that terms is different than trying to describe theology in a pre-modern terms, which is what we do when it doesn't rain. Now let's turn to God the Father. I believe in God the Father. The creed's a starting point of that in this Christian confession, but we know that even the creed derives itself from the revelation of God as Father, especially in the Gospels. Jesus revealed God as Father in relational quality, but we can see elements of that in the Old Testament as well. It also reflects forms of belief. Where are we with belief? When we talk about God as Father, we're talking about a relational connection in light of a revelation through a specific moment in history that has been transmitted through different points of history. Well, that's one thing, but maybe we're at this point of I don't even know how to believe with God. I don't even know what God is. How do I navigate God? How do I believe in a Father? I have bad experiences with my Father. So this is where belief also has a narrowing element. When we confess the creed, we're saying God is this, and God not only exists, but God is revealed in this certain way, so we have to believe in this certain kind of God. And in talking about God in this way, we're talking about a form of reality that God interacts with everything that is in this way. God is Father. But what does that mean to us? It's not enough to recite the Apostles' Creed, Wolfhart Pannenberg writes. One must enter into its statements inquiringly, reflectively, critically. If this is something we are going to live in, we need to find ways of taking ownership of it, of coming to terms with it, with what this means in our life, in our experiences, as a way of saying it's true, but how can it be true for me? Maybe I need to understand God's fathership better. Maybe I need to wrestle with my own experiences with my father. I have a good experience with my father. So that affects this image of God as Father in one way, where other people need to say, my experience with Father was horrible, but God's fatherhood reflects what it should be, how things can be. And I believe in that reality, even though my experiences are different. We also need to realize that we're uniting with Christians in talking about the creed. We're not just expressing our personal convictions. So we're saying there's this truth that as a community, as a people, we are going to share in this truth, and we learn from each other. That we learn from different experiences, that we learn from different questions. That, like I said about Father, because I had a good experience with my father, I can't just say, God is Father because fathers are good. Well, that's different. So today's widespread lack of comprehension of the formula, I believe in God the Father, the call, not for getting rid of these statements altogether, but for their explanation, for walking through. So we talk about theology in this course to you, so you can learn about these things on these discussions, maybe to answer your questions, but also so that you can help others navigate these questions, so that they can say, what does it mean to believe in God as Father? What are ways people have talked about this? What are ways that people are needing to talk about this? And it comes back to us. Why do you believe? I have a longer answer for this. I'm not going to extend the lecture, but I'll go ahead and post it. Why do you believe in God? Most of us don't believe in God because we've been rationally convinced of it. Most of us have this experience with God, a proof of God that may not be provable to others, but gives an absolute sense of truth of God. Almost all theologians have this as well. We have this starting point, and understanding our starting point is helpful because then theology isn't something that's distant from us, that's extra, that's extraneous to our real encounter with God, but what we realize is our experience with God, the reason we believe and are in this current discussion, wrestling with these things, is because we believe in a certain way and are trying to navigate it. Well, there's the starting point of theology as well. What do you believe about God? Why do you believe in God? Sit with that question and see that the rest of what we talk about is connected to that, and that is your starting point, that then we start finding connections with others in time and history in our own context, others in this class. What's your story of belief? We'll press on, but I want you to think about that. I believe in God the Father, so God as Father. The meaning of Father also is one of those words that changes over time, but there's an element of consistency. There's a relational quality to Father. There's a defining quality of the term Father. The Father gives genes. The Father gives history and context and background and setting and often roles. There's a patriarch. The Father is the one who is traditionally seen as in charge. We also see, when we say, I believe in God the Father, we're saying God is the Father of the Son. We believe in Jesus, and in believing in Jesus, because he rose again, remember that's where we started, we say we believe in God as the Father of this experience. This person has God as Father, thus in believing in this person, we believe in this kind of God who relates to the Son in this kind of way. Elizabeth Johnson, I think, gives us some helpful ground rules of talking about God as Father and talking about theology, which is one, the reality of the living God is an ineffable mystery beyond all telling. So when we say, I believe in God the Father, we're not limiting it to a narrow definition of our experiences or the experiences of others. We're saying we enter into a scope of God's reality that is beyond our experiences and beyond our own stories and beyond what anyone can say, but it helps orient it, but it's also beyond that. No expression for God can be taken literally. So when we say, I believe in God the Father, we're trying to put in human terms a relational revelation about God that goes beyond the word Father, goes beyond our concept of Father. It's helpful, but it's not exact to what we can say. And so we want to say God is this older guy living in this sky fortress. Sometimes Christianity characterizes that. It's not really what Christianity says, but we say God is Father as a way of speaking expansively, not limitedly. And God has many names. We see this throughout the Bible. God has many ways of saying who God is. God gives names as a way of description, and Father is among those, given especially by Jesus. God is Father. So we say, our Father who is in heaven. God, among the other names, has this name. And people resonate with names in different ways. Some people really relate to God more closely as Father. Others relate to God as Lord. To say that we relate to God in certain terms isn't to limit God. It's to say that that's just meets where we're at, and that we can't reject those other names, but we also have to say that other people can't insist that we use terms that may not be as close to us, even though those may be true. So God and Father defines reality. This is how things are. God is the Father of Jesus. He's also the Father, the creator of the universe. So everything that is defined by the God who made this is. So God is the Father of all things. God is holy. God defines what reality is. God defines who he is. God was not fathered. So God, in being his own self, has his own way of relating, and we can call this holiness, which isn't so much separateness, because Jesus got involved in the world. The Spirit is involved in this world. There's not, in being the Holy Spirit, it's not the distant Spirit, it's the engaged Spirit. But the Spirit is consistent with who God is, and that who God is can be called holy. So holy is a way of defining what is true about God, what is true about reality. It also is about identity. We are who we are because God is who God is. God made us. God defined us. God doesn't have anything else that defines him. God is the source for all identity. God is the source of all meaning. And so God then shares this. We only have meaning and purpose and existence because of God, and so we have to derive our identity from the one who derives identity from God's own self. God's holiness is his self. His identity, that as a totality of fullness, is the hope and terror of an incomplete human, which has no inherent identity itself, but is continually confronted with the reality of incompleteness, something the human ego strives against in various ways. As a source of being, it is only God's self that provides a self to each other. Any other attempt to derive selfhood besides God results in judgment. It's not a decision of God's anger, but it's a reality of human incompleteness that cannot exist apart from God's existence. I believe in God the Father. So for us, this isn't just a extraneous category. It also means promise. God is Father, and God promises, and God is faithful in his promise, and God is faithful in his provision. The promise of God is the fulfillment of God as God will do what he says he will do. The hope confronts circumstances in light of God's declarative identity, and confronts those living apart from God as those who are not in line with God's identity or his promises. This means then that hope is not an otherworldly, ethereal, or mystical hope, but a present hope, an awaited fulfillment of God's work in our context. Even more than this, Christian hope is hope not just even about new circumstances or events working out in a transformative way, but we don't experience this way yet. We don't experience the fullness of the promise, and so we say, for us, this means believing in God the Father is still provisional. We await God's provision. And we await the unfulfilled experience with hope that it will eventually be fulfilled, but maybe not in the way that we want. My kids ask things of me, and I respond to them, but not always in the way they want, but in the way that I hope was the best for them, and in a timing that is my own timing. It is about new circumstances and events, but it's more than this. Christian hope is tied to the God of hope who puts his own identity at risk in the event of his promise, so that What we are really hoping for is for God to be truly God. In the event of the promise, God determines to be faithful to himself through being faithful to his people. Hope becomes in this way a truly theological category, as our hope is first in the God who promises to be faithful, and then in light of that, an expectation that what is promised will be fulfilled in accordance with his own identity as God. So we have hope. We have hope in the promise, and even though this provisional experience is our current experience, the promise is true, and so we can live in light of this truth being fact. As a specific promise for particular people, this hope can never be generalized. As some kind of vague religious sentiment concerning a notion of the divine, the particularity of the specific God who works in specific ways and specific promising, specific expressions of faithfulness leads to specific responses in specific contexts as people are oriented within the trajectory of this promise. It's a lot to say, but hopefully you get the idea that it's specific. It's real life. It's not just this vague, mystical category of symbolic religiousness. In this specificness, it might be proposed that faith and hope and love are really our theological categories, and more than this, essentially the same kind of theological category. So when we start talking about God, we're really developing what these mean in light of revelation and our experiences. Love is the greatest because it is the continuation of the same active theological response that is first characterized in the mode of faith, we believe in God, then the mode of hope, we trust in God, then persisting in the mode of love, we respond to others, God and others, because these things are true. This is how things are shaped. And in light of those things being true, we live out this truth in a relational expression of love. I believe in God the Father. I'm going to turn back to Elizabeth Johnson's work in Quest for the Living God, which is a great one-volume introduction that goes over the broad discussions in theology. I don't use it for this class, but I've used it elsewhere and I recommend it. I like her work because she draws from a lot of different streams and draws together in a way that I think is approachable for many people. She was a student of Karl Rahner, the great Catholic theologian of the mid-20th century, one of the more influential theologians, especially because of his work in Vatican II. She writes in Quest for the Living God, "At the heart of the Christian faith is the almost unbelievable idea that the infinitely incomprehensible holy mystery of God does not remain forever remote, but draws near in radical proximity to the world. This is what we confess. This is what we believe, that God the Father, above all things, is with us." So she emphasizes these categories, and I'm using this as an example of ways contemporary theology tries to come to terms with classical notions in new postmodern, even we can say, ways. She emphasizes transcendence. God's fathomless otherness is taken as absolute and articulated as mystery, always ever greater. She emphasizes God's immanence. God's intimate and faithful nearness is also taken absolutely and articulated as mystery, ever nearer. This holy mystery. Theism does justice to neither immanence nor transcendence. This idea that we can talk about God in vague general sense doesn't necessarily touch base with who God is in his particularity, in his particular revelation. So in Christian statements, we can't just devolve into a theism and then add Christian elements and say, okay, you believe in a God, now here let's put a package. It's indivisible. We say God has revealed himself in certain ways, and this is who God is, and this is what a God is, because this is the only God who is. God is. Loving God means loving the world, encompassed by incomprehensible holy mystery. We allow our hearts to be conformed to God's own heart, which pours out loving kindness on the world and unrepentant faithfulness. We believe in God, orthodoxy, believe in a certain kind of God who leads us into certain kinds of experiences with ourselves, with those around us. We love. And we act in light of these things being true. We respond to others, enacting our theology. This is what theology as a whole should be about: orthodoxy, orthopathy, orthopraxy. And even in just this one coverage of the statement, I believe in God the Father, we haven't even finished that whole line. I believe in God the Father. We already see the importance of how orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and orthopathy come together in a holistic expression in which you can't just isolate one or the other without dissolving or dismissing them. If you try to cut one loose, it becomes imbalanced and dysfunctional. They mutually inform each other in this dance, this circle, this web of meaning and interpretive development that we can call systematic, but goes beyond that in as much systematic can be thought to only speak about the mind. It becomes three-dimensional. four-dimensional because it interacts in time and space, enacted through time, and as God reveals and as God shows himself, we respond and express our theology in our words, in our actions, in our experiences as self. So I believe in God the Father. What are the questions of our day? What are the questions that you're encountering? And just in light of that statement, what does it mean to believe in God? What does it mean to believe in God as Father? How are you wrestling with this? What resources can you use to help provide answers? What other questions are being asked in your context, which is different than my context? Even if we might live, for a few of us, in the same general geographic region, your context is still different, let alone those who are coming from different parts of the country or even the world, as we have. These are all ways of navigating what we say is true, but also ways of navigating how we talk about an eternal God, an infinite God, a God who's so beyond one context that it takes the entirety of human interaction over history, over time and space. We all contribute a part, so our questions and how we respond to them can be oriented, but they contribute to this bigger sense of God that is a more holistic theology as we go forward.